Alright everybody, and welcome to the first of hopefully many RWBY theories. So I have a few in mind that will be the first four episodes, I guess. Although I'm not really sure which one I want to do first. I mean, the thing is, I have in mind, some favorites that have already been heard from, a few that have already been discussed over, and I guess two that maybe not so much. Uh, the ones I'm thinking about for these first four are going to be Crow and his relationship to Ruby. Uh, I mean, we already know that he's her uncle. But I know that there's a theory floating around about whether or not he's Ruby's actual father. Plot twist: Yang and Ruby aren't sisters; they're cousins. Um, well, yeah, cousins. Because then Crow would be Ruby's father, and Raven would be Yang's mother, making them cousins. Yeah, just get Summer Rose out of the picture for the moment. Um, then we also have uh, the theory over the moon in RWBY, which is sort of a big deal in the show, and it's been featured pretty heavily since the Red trailer. We've seen it in White. We've seen it in opening credit sequences and like Volume 3, where essentially the moon has just been sort of cracking over time, and I've heard a theory out there about whether or not it's like a Grim egg. Um, and I do see there being a possibility with that, like pulling some sort of Doctor Who moon thing from season 8. And the big question is whether it's going to be spawning a giant Grim or whether it's going to be spawning multiple smaller sized Grim, which both are equal possibilities, but I'll go more in depth with that later. There is also the relationship between our baddies. I mean, throughout volumes 1 through 3, I've seen some interesting connections between Cinder, Emerald, Mercury, Torchwick. Although I guess Torchwick really doesn't matter at this point. Spoiler alert, he dies in Volume 3. Neo. I'm not really sure if I want to include Adam in there, and I'm also not really sure if I want to include Junior in there either. I mean, Junior isn't exactly a villain of the show, even though he's sort of been portrayed as such. Kind of, he's just more of a gangster informant for Yang, and I don't really see him as being much else. The only really bad thing that he's done in connection with the bad guys of the show has been loaning out some of his goons to Torchwick, and aside from that, he has been one of the more easygoing bad guys. Although his two goons have... There might be some interesting stuff that goes on with them, and who knows, maybe they'll bring him back as a bigger villain now that Torchwick's gone. And then my favorite out of the four, the four Maidens. And who they are or were, and who they might end up being. It's clearly not going to be Pyrrha who becomes the new Autumn, but there have been some connections I've seen so far throughout the series, and I guess there have just been some bigger clues as to who they might be, and I don't know, I guess the one that I can sort of do off of the top of my head is that one. So I guess that is what we will be doing for this first episode. Make it a big deal with my favorite. So from what we've been able to gather from the story of the Four Maidens, I guess there will also be a separate one on who the wizard is or will turn out to be. But the Four Maidens. We know that there is a summer, an autumn, a winter, and a spring maiden. And we know that one of the current generations of the Four Maidens, Autumn, has died. And we know who has her powers at the moment. I.e., Cinder. But I think there's a possibility that we've met two others at this point. Sort of met two others. And those two others are Summer and Winter. Because at this point we know two characters who are named after those two seasons. Summer Rose and Winter Schnee. And we also know from the special RWBY episodes that names are a pretty big deal in Remnant. And as far as the seasonal theme goes, it would sort of make sense that winter could be one of the new iterations of the Winter Maidens. The Schnee Dust Company has pretty big connections with the seasons specifically the winter season. Schnee is sort of meant to be snow and whatnot, and they have a snowflake as their main symbol. So, I think there's a pretty good chance of winter being the current iteration of winter, I guess. And some other connections between her and the Winter Maidens is her connection with General James Ironwood. We know that the Maidens are sort of being protected by the... I don't know what I want to call Ozpin's group. Syndicate? Inner Circle? Or whatever? And we've seen that they are protected by those inner connections, and that group knows who the our various seasonally named maidens are. And it just sort of makes sense that winter is one of the top level members of the Atlas military group. I mean, sure, she has that connection with her father, but to be that close to the general, instead of just sort of being protected by a general sort of group of soldiers, leads me to believe that she might be of greater importance to the world of Remnant than other sort of random minor characters might be. And they've said that through winter that the Schnees have two inherited sort of semblances, which further leads me to believe that the Winter Maiden's abilities are sort of inherent with the Schnee family. And maybe big old Grandma Schnee gave it down to Winter and Weiss's mother, and then she's apparently dead, because we have only heard talks about Weiss's father and not too much else about her mother. I mean, in Volume 2, when the staff person is like, "Hey, would you like to talk to Winter or your father?" It just sort of seems weird to me that the whole mother thing is left out of it. And as far as the Winter Maiden goes, well, I'll go into that a bit later. I'll just sort of keep the maidens as in their specific generation. We haven't seen Spring yet, I don't believe. We at least haven't heard of a Spring character. And I sort of get the feeling that we won't for another few seasons. Especially given that the again, I'll go into that a bit later, because spring is sort of going into the subject of the next generation of Maiden. But Summer Rose. Again, another unique sort of name that has some sort of connection with the maidens of the fairy tale, I guess. And we haven't really heard too much about her yet, aside from her name, and we haven't seen her abilities either, which I've read about the Gray Eyes ability as far as Summer's concerned, and Ruby, of course, inherited it, but sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. Gray Eyes, Ruby inherited it, but we haven't really seen a weapon as far as she's concerned. And we've seen another character who doesn't really use weapons, and that is Cinder. I mean, sure, she has that bow that she summons, but I think that's sort of in connection with the small amount of Autumn's abilities that we know that she has inherited by Autumn having seen her before she died, which, again, before I go back into details about Summer, is sort of another character that we have seen as having had a protector in Crow, which we know that Crow, Tai Yang, and Raven were on a team with Summer, and it seems pretty interesting that they somehow rose to be such a big deal in the world of Remnant when there are probably several other hunters throughout the Remnant universe. I mean, sure, Crow is really, really skilled, and as is Raven, and we haven't really seen Tai Yang yet, but we know that in terms of teams, Team Quartz was pretty impressive. And we also know that Tai Yang sort of just lost it after he lost Summer. Although I'd like to see him sort of come back a bit later and see what sort of combat he's capable of. But yeah, Crow was following Autumn around, and I think he was sort of meant to be her guardian, which was why he ended up just being there, ready to defend her from Cinder, Mercury, and Emerald that first time. And that might explain another thing later on. But maybe a couple of things later on. But yeah, where was I going with Summer? I sort of went back to autumn for some reason. Give me a second. Alright, so I forgot where I was going with summer originally, but, I do have something else that comes to mind, so, as we know, Tai Yang just sort of lost it after Summer ended up passing, but what if it were for more than just the reason that he lost someone who he loved? As I've previously mentioned, their group seems to have had some sort of duty in defending the Maidens, and they had a pretty big rise in levels of hunters and huntresses. And as far as Tai Yang goes, sort of makes sense that him being married to Summer would have made him her defender, I guess. And what if he just sort of... Part of the reason that he lost it was because of the fact that he had lost more than just a wife. Maybe it's also because he failed in his mission, which was to protect her. And so that's a sort of side theory down on its own. What happened to Tai Yang, I guess. But and we didn't really see much of Crow before the Autumn incident, but his failure in protecting her could also sort of explain the drinking habit that he sort of has fallen back on, like... People deal with depression in different ways. Tai Yang, I guess, sort of just lost his will in fighting and whatnot, and Crow just sort of turned to drinking, and I'm not really sure what will come of winter and spring, as we haven't seen spring all that much. Don't really even know who's defending her. But like I said, that will probably come eventually. Sort of makes me wonder as well where Peter Port and Bartholomew Oobleck fit in with all of this. I mean, I'm not really sure if they're even a part of Ozpin's central sort of group. They don't really seem to be, they just sort of seem to be teachers. I mean, we've seen Glinda, Ironwood, Crow, Winter, Oz. I'm not sure if I mentioned him already. That's 5. Tai Yang, and wherever Raven fits in all of this. But just sort of another sort of side theory in this particular one. now I guess we sort of go on to the next level of I guess this particular theory and who the next four maidens are going to be. I mean, I think one already may have her powers, and I think another will be the death of Cinder. One might be in the current Maiden's final thoughts, and the other might just be the last person that the Maiden sees. We know that Pyrrha did not get any of the Autumn Maiden's powers, and if she did, the rest sort of went to Cinder, given that Cinder was probably the last person in her thoughts when she died. Or maybe some of it went to Jean. I don't know. But I guess we will find that out in Volume 4. But I think our main quartet, RWBY, their group is going to be the next four maidens, and I have some pretty heavy reasons behind this belief. The first is that, as far as Team RWBY goes, well, of course, as far as Team RWBY goes, we're talking about Team RWBY. We've already seen them with connections to the seasons. In each of their trailers, there is some sort of seasonal connection for each of them. Yang is connected with the sun. We first see Blake in what looks like the fall. We don't really see the season that Weiss is in, but I feel like we can sort of assume that she's winter, and even though RWBY is sort of in the trailer that looks like it's taking place during a winter season, it could also just sort of be the transition between winter and spring. Or, who knows, maybe they just sort of had it mixed up, or maybe when we were going through the trailers, we were going through the seasons backwards. Spring, winter, fall, and summer. Which I guess would technically make more sense than just they did the seasons out of order. And I've sort of been wondering about the whole season thing since the thing originally happened. First I thought that it could have been just trying to go in terms of 4, like the teams and whatnot. It's sort of 4 is a big deal number within the RWBYverse. But now with the added bonus of knowing about the various seasons, we just sort of know that there's a bigger connection. Uh, so I guess which one do I want to go with first? I've already sort of discussed Blake, I guess, in that I had said that there's going to be someone that kills Cinder, and I kind of think that it will be Blake, and aside from just her connection with Fall, I think there are some other reasons with that. Even though in each of the opening credits we see RWBY fighting Cinder, which, big surprise, she's fighting the one who is the big baddie at the particular time. Blake sort of has a bigger beef with Cinder than any of them. Even though Cinder is sort of the one responsible for Penny's death and Pyrrha's death, which RWBY saw, Cinder's the one who corrupted the White Fang and changed Adam into what he is now. And Blake didn't like the change, and it's sort of been affecting her since the first time we see her in trailer 1. And so it kind of gives me reason to believe that she'll be the one to kill Cinder, and as we've already discussed about, the one who kills the Maiden is sort of the one who becomes the last person in their thoughts, and is therefore the one who inherits their powers. As far as Weiss is concerned, I feel like we're going to see Winter die at some point or another. We know that characters in RWBY can die now, and we're probably going to see a lot more of that as the seasons progress. Volumes. I guess that's why they chose volume instead of season, in terms of what they call the various groupings of the chapters in RWBY. Aside from the fact that it sort of makes it seem like a book, it's better than just sort of adding more seasons to the term of seasons, and it also sort of gives it more of that fairy tale connection, which is another sort of big deal within the series. Also, sorry that I keep looking away from the camera. I'm doing it with the other end of the camera instead of the selfie end, because this end has the better form of lighting, and I'm in an area where I can just sort of look at the reflection and see how the picture is doing, I guess. But I think that Winter is going to die in front of Weiss, and given that Weiss is just sort of Weiss and Winter sort of have a better bond than Weiss and her father, from what we've seen so far, even though she didn't really want to talk to her back in Volume 2. I think that Winter really cares for her sister, and she'll see Weiss at some point during their battle, and during her death scene, and then Weiss will be the final one in her thoughts, and she'll give the Winter Maiden power to Weiss. I'm technically not really sure if a male can inherit the powers. I think it's sort of a genderish thing in which would explain why Jeanne couldn't inherit the power from Pyrrha if she had any powers at that point. Then we have the person who inherits Summer's ability. We know that Summer did have a Maiden's abilities, like I said, it would explain why she isn't necessarily in need of a weapon. And she also has the gray eyes, which I think that she gave her powers to Yang. And the reason for that is she knows that RWBY has inherited one of her abilities in the form of her gray eye powers, and I think she wanted Yang to have some sort of protection inherited from her as well, and from what we've heard from Yang, she and Summer seem to have had a pretty good relationship. With Yang being all like, Summer was the best, slayer of monsters and baker of cookies. So I think that Summer would have had enough care for her stepdaughter to have wanted her to have some sort of protection as well, which we've sort of seen the abilities that the Maidens get from using the Maiden abilities, and I think I'll do that. Autofocus. And it sort of affects their design, or the art design. Gives it sort of a different coloring, and whenever Yang uses her semblance, it sort of had a similar look to what we saw Cinder get in Volume 3. I'm just kind of going off of what I remember here, and from a month or two ago, and don't bite my neck if I'm incorrect about that, please, but I do sort of recall the art design looking similar. But it also explains a few other things, like I think by the time that RWBY and Yang went into the woods, Summer had already died. And so by that logic, Yang would have already had the Fall, or the Summer Maiden's powers. Summer Rose's powers. And we've already sort of talked about the defense of the characters who have the powers. And I think that would explain why Crow showed up when he did. We know that he follows around the Maidens in order to keep them safe, and he might have been following around Yang in order to try and protect her, and that is why he ended up just sort of showing up out of nowhere. I mean, either that or he just sort of realized what they were trying to do and were somehow able to guess their location based off of that. Although, having followed them seems more like his style. Especially given what we saw at the end of Volume 3, where when Ruby, Jean, Ren, and Nora were heading out on their own, he just sort of followed them from a safe distance, which is what I think happened there, and he's fine with letting his nieces, Heather Theory, go and do their own sort of thing and just sort of be there to protect them. With his badass scythe abilities, it also explains what Raven was doing. I mean, aside from just sort of being there to protect her daughter, I think that she was also there to sort of take the task of defending the Summer Maiden, and who knows what Raven's sort of mentality is at this point, but we know that she said that she wouldn't be showing up to defend Yang like that again. Mother of the Year award goes over to Raven Branwyn. But yeah, I don't know, I guess it also sort of explains the flamish sort of abilities that Yang gets when she activates her semblance. Maybe it's not actually supposed to look like that. Maybe she just sort of is meant to gain power over time, but not in that same sort of sense that we've seen in the show. So maybe she has two sort of powers at this point. And she might not be aware of it yet. But I'm thinking Raven's going to show up next season and just sort of get her pointed in the right direction. Especially now that she's sort of depressed after having lost her arm. Like father, like daughter. Go into sort of a depressed state and refuse to do anything. But I think that is all that I have to say for Yang. Then we have RWBY, who is slightly unlike the others in the sense that I don't think she's going to get her seasonal power for a while. We haven't seen Spring yet, and RWBY's just gained the new power of the Grey Eye ability, and I don't think that Miles, Carrie, or Monty would want her to get that extra bit of power for a while at least, until she's either mastered her abilities that she has right now, or if she ends up reaching a point where she just sort of needs the abilities, and then Spring will give Ruby the powers, and Ruby will be the top dog of the show again. Then they go and fight What's-Her-Face? Salem, I guess, and win, and by their powers combined, they become the 4 Maidens using their powers to become a hero or whatever. I don't know. Just sort of blathered off the top of my head there, I guess. But yeah, I think that just about wraps up my thoughts on that particular subject for now.